Hi, Chris. Welcome to the Finite Podcast.
Hey, thanks, Jody. Thanks for having me here.
I am very excited to have you here today. When I found out about the topic that you're an expert in, you've written a book about, I was immediately excited. I know that some people might shy away from this topic, but I think it's something that our listeners will be super interested in, and we'll get more into it later. But as we always do, I'd love to start by getting a little bit of an introduction to yourself, who you are, what got you into marketing, and where you are now.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in marketing for more than a few decades, and I started my own agencies. I founded and sold two digital marketing agencies with a lot of B2B clients, actually. I got involved very early on with the internet, so I founded an early digital agency in the mid 1990s that was acquired by Publicis Group. And then I founded a content marketing agency after that that ended up getting acquired by a mid-sized agency called Rain in Portland in the United States. And I've always enjoyed marketing. I mean, back when I got into marketing, it was a place where a misfit could fit in. It was like if you couldn't do anything else, you could do marketing. That's not true today at all. I mean, it's so much more data driven and evidence based, which also ended up appealing to me quite a bit. So the transition into that was easy, and I throughout that entire career in founding my own agencies, there was one topic I was really interested in, which was just human insight. The account planning or the research function that goes into marketing. I always wanted to know, why do people buy what they buy? Which is fundamental to marketing. I mean, if you don't know why someone buys your product, then it's a bit difficult to do, but it's also a really challenging question to answer at the same time. And so that's what ultimately led to the topic of the book I wrote. It's really fundamentally about human insight.
Yeah, I think even though it sounds basic at first glance, I think you're honing on something very fundamental and important. People, particularly in consumer, have low um, money to spend in a cost of living crisis, and to get to the point where they actually want to spend their money on something is a huge it seems small, but it's a huge decision. And in B2B particularly, budgets are also smaller, and actually making that leap to buy a product, I think marketers sometimes undervalue, um, and kind of don't really see the whole picture of that decision making process, and how big it actually can be, especially in a B2B organization. So thank you for that introduction. Yeah, really, really great. Do you want to talk about your book? Could you tell us how you got here, what made you start thinking about this topic, and yeah, any key insights?
Yeah. So I've always, as I mentioned, I'm into human insight and research, and I subscribe to a lot of research companies, and one of them is Pew Research, and in December 2020 they published a research report that was quite unique. It was in the United States. It was right after Joe Biden got elected president, and the research allowed liberals and conservatives to express what they wanted the other side to know about them personally. And so it was open ended. It wasn't, it was a lot of open ended questions and, oh, I'm sorry, open ended responses. And I read through several hundred of them just because I thought it was interesting. And what struck me was, wow, these are two authentic points of view and different ways of seeing the world. How can this not affect what people buy? Okay. That was the fundamental insight. Like, how could it be possible that worldview, as liberal or conservative, doesn't affect what people buy? So I set out and I thought, okay, I first need to determine, is there a business case for this? Okay. And if there's a business case, then what are the distinctions that a business can use in order to think about these two groups as two different markets? And then how do you make it actionable would be the third piece, right? And I knew I very quickly found the business case. I mean, you don't have to do a lot of research to find that liberals and conservatives, and those are defined a little differently country by country, but liberals and conservatives align with different brands, buy quite different products, and consume different media. And it's not that there's certainly overlap. Okay, it's not completely exclusive, but the trends are very strong. Once I saw that, I'm like, wow, this isn't something we've ever looked at as marketers. We haven't considered how people see the world, what their worldview is, right? Because each worldview, if you oversimplify it, it basically represents how people see the world, the facts they like to believe, the way they think the world operates. And there's two very big distinctions. So stumbling into this, it became obvious to me that this is just like looking at people's income levels or where they live or gender or anything else that you might consider in terms of targeting or understanding your customer. And that became very exciting, and as I got more into it, I realized, wow, I wish I'd known this stuff before, because I could think of all kinds of instances where the teams with me made mistakes on this front, and we did not create alignment where we could have. But at the same time, it's like, well, okay, better late than never to learn all these things.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. I think not many people have made that leap to political ideologies. I know that a lot of brands are thinking about social ideologies at the moment, especially in Pride Month, changing their whether or not to change their logo to a rainbow color, and other social kind of movements that they get on board with. Do you think there's a link between those two worldviews in a buyer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the and what it boils down to, like if I keep using the term worldview, right? Which is it's not so much political party, although politics is an expression of worldview. Okay, and I think the insight that turned me around on this was, yeah, politics doesn't drive someone's worldview. It's the other way around. Like people form a worldview, and in the research I did, which is detailed in the book, is that people started sorting themselves broadly into liberal and conservative, and there are all kinds of other definitions. But I'm thinking about marketing and businesses. I'm not trying to explain how every single person votes, but the sorting of people into more liberal or more conservative worldviews really started in the 1950s with the advent of television, when all of a sudden big events were being brought into the living room for the first time in video. In the United States, civil rights, the Vietnam War, the first presidential election, and so the data shows that the sorting of people into these two groups started then, and then it actually takes a huge spike up with digital technology in the year 2000. And in terms of how it shapes what people buy, I mean, there's an enormous amount of evidence about, like Harris, for example, the big research company in the United States that publishes a lot of interesting surveys. Every year they publish a list of brands that align more with liberals or conservatives in terms of trust. And I have here the brands that tend to align more with uh, liberal audiences in the United States include Target, Toyota, Nike, and Honda. And with conservative audiences, Home Depot, General Motors, USAA. Now, USAA is an insurance company that sells to military families. And those aren't a surprise, but the data is very clear, but it extends beyond that. Like it gets to media consumption. So in the United States, the people who watch or have watched How to Get Away with Murder, Modern Family, Doctor Who almost are exclusively liberal. SEAL Team, Last Man Standing, New Amsterdam are almost exclusively conservative. So it's not just the news channels that draw the two different groups. And then you have all kinds of other products, like in the United States, there are funny things that come up, like Genio turkey bacon skews liberal, while Hormel bacon skews conservative. And so why? Well, you look at the branding, you look at the values the companies are projecting. Now, none of these companies may be involved in politics at all. They may not be expressing any political viewpoint whatsoever. Because the fact is, every organization projects a worldview. There's no such thing as being neutral. And that's another big insight that came out of the research. If you think if you stay out of politics, your business is neutral to both groups. It's not true at all. All you have to do is look at who your customers are, understand if they're more liberal or conservative, look at your market. There's skews all over the place. And understanding these things becomes kind of exciting because it becomes a new strategic lever to use in business to drive growth. It's just sitting there to be looked at as long as someone is willing to ask the question, are my customers more liberal or conservative? Most companies don't know. And when we reveal it, to companies we work with, it's usually sometimes it's a surprise, sometimes it's not. And people go, oh wow, they just had no idea of what was going on that front.
Yeah, awesome. Some really interesting insights there. And I really want to know what it is about these brands that, even though they're not actively promoting any political side, draws this audience. I think you're so correct that politics is a representation of worldview, even if your entire worldview doesn't revolve around politics or isn't skewed in your daily life by politics. And we have so often these buyer personas in marketing where you've got age, location, when you had kids, and all of these things that like largely don't matter and don't affect worldview as much as something like politics. So it's almost worth in all buyer persona research that you're doing for your company putting a line like political ideology and testing that, because you're right, it is more representative of your behavior and your opinions on broader things.
That's exactly right. And I'm so glad you brought up the personas because, yeah, they don't address this at all. Yet it's so easy to include. It's honestly not difficult to figure out if your customers are more liberal or conservative. And the way I tell people is like, to that point of politics being an expression of worldview, people shop for products just like they shop for politicians. It's the same thing. It's who or what is a better fit for my life and represents how I want to live and the world I want to create around me. And the world I want to create around me includes the people I want to run the government, but it also includes everything around me, all kinds of products, and whether it's the car you drive or the clothing you wear or whatever it is you buy. And I tell people it's like, look, all you have to do if you live in an urban environment, all you have to do generally, and I won't speak for everywhere in the world, but I think it's mostly true. If you drive 3 hours in any direction, 4 hours, it'll feel like a very different place. Like it'll feel sometimes like a completely different planet. And why is that? Well, when you go from a more population dense area to a less population dense area, you're generally going from a more liberal area to a more conservative area. And the cues you pick up tend to be the cars they drive, the clothing they wear, the restaurants they go to, the food they buy. It's all stuff people buy. And those become the signals of the culture, which includes worldview. And, so it really helps explain things like that. And that's when light bulbs can go off in your head. It's like, oh, okay, this is why my customers are this way, or my market is this way or that way, because markets themselves can skew more liberal or conservative. And if you just understand that, it becomes a really interesting lever to explore. And again, you don't have to bring up any politics. You don't have to express anything that's in the media. It can boil down to the core values, which are all detailed in the book.
Yeah, interesting. Um, cool. So I I want to know if when a brand does this market research and finds that they're skewing either more conservative or more liberal, do you think that they should, the best strategy going forward would be to lean into that side or balance it out with the other? How do you go about not alienating one side while also kind of going with the data like most marketers would in any situation, is like leaning into what's already working for you?
Right. I mean, that's exactly it. Now, I have to say there's no bad answer to that question, like which market should I go with? And the reason is because there are going to be some organizations where, well, most organizations, founder culture tends to be the root of the worldview that is expressed in the market by almost every single business. You can go back to it, it doesn't matter if the founders started the business 50, 60, 70 years ago. It really doesn't matter. It's been amazing to see this and study this. So you've got a founder culture that tends to heavily influence how a business projects itself onto the market. And then the question becomes, does that align with the market or not? So should you lean, like to your question, should you lean into one or the other? My answer tends to be, yeah, go with your strength. Strength gets strength, just like any other, attribute of your customer. But I acknowledge though that there are going to be some businesses that are like, our values are our values, and we're not going to deviate from that. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable answer, because some people are not going to feel comfortable saying, "Oh, wow, we actually have a fairly liberal culture, and our values are this, and wow, you're telling us that our customers are actually a lot more conservative." That may create some discomfort. I would say most companies we talk to actually they're they are fascinated by the differences and understanding them without any politics, and they're like, "Oh, wow, yeah, no, we can do this." Because you can go after both groups or one group without any controversy. And to your point about alienation of one group or the other, it generally doesn't happen. Let me put it a different way, because you said alienation. What happens is if your business projects one set of values, and we can get into some of the specific values in a minute. If your business projects one set of values and your market, a portion of your market, maybe a majority of your market, isn't aligned with those values, your brand just fades into the background. People don't get upset. Okay. For example, the Mini Cooper car skews very liberal in the United States. It's definitely an urban liberal car. I mean, almost without exception. When they advertise on TV, they don't make conservatives angry. It just fades into the background. It just disappears. And that's the risk if you don't look at this for your business, because if you're fading into the background, for a big part of your market, well, that's creating a headwind for your business that's going to show up in higher cost of acquisition, a lower customer loyalty, all kinds of metrics that are going to be, challenging. And this is a simple insight that can actually help turn that around.
Yeah, awesome. I'd love to get into the actual values that each group holds in a bit, but just quickly, I think it's so fascinating that these businesses are so tied to their founders' own values. It really just shows that like companies are an embodiment of their founder, which is fascinating. But I was wondering, as with social ideologies, again, I know that there's a lot of fluctuation with what brands tend to embody depending on the socio-political climate. Do you see any fluctuation with companies and the political ideologies and values that they present?
Well, I think what happens is, depending on who's running the country, you might have businesses moderating a little bit here and there in terms of what they're doing. Okay. But, with this idea that the whole country has changed somewhat, and that's actually not true. I mean, if you look at the numbers, they're fascinating how split down the middle almost every country is, right? Liberal and conservative, depending on how you define them. And I realize there's not always a clear distinction, but in general, you've got two markets. I'll use the United States. Two markets of equal size. If each one was a country, they'd be the 10th largest in the world. They have equal spending power. Liberal customers have higher income, but they also live in urban environments with higher cost of living and higher cost of food. And when you net all that out, both markets have equal spending power. An interesting one that I didn't put in the book because it seemed a little obscure, but the research shows that they both have equal IQ. It's kind of, so these are both great markets. And so, it's a business doesn't have to necessarily fluctuate. I think it's more important to understand, well, what do we have? Because in all the companies' data that we've analyzed, the closest we've seen to customers being 50-50 was about 62, 48. It was like it was still askew, right? And recently we worked with two businesses, same time. One was overwhelmingly liberal customers, one was overwhelmingly conservative customers. And it's not that they're far left or far right. Most of them are going to be moderate, but the values that you can lean into in order to align with those two groups are very clear. So the strategies around how you brief the creative, how you select the media, um, and everything else all of a sudden starts to get shaped, and it adds to what you already know about your customer. It doesn't replace anything, right? It's another filter that becomes super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And it comes back to what you said at the start of political ideology being a representation of your values. I get that now. It's not an intentional marketing tool, it's just an awareness of your market
Hmm.
and your customers. So, can we get into the values themselves, and can you name any values that align with left or right, and maybe our listeners can play along and work on and figure out which their company is just from maybe the values that they might embody.
Yeah, and I will. And yeah, it's interesting because sometimes there will be divergence between someone's political expression and the values they hold. And it can happen as people age. People tend to become more conservative as they age, even though they might, vote liberal. Okay. And, it's funny. My mother-in-law read my book and said, I'm actually a red, even though she lives in a community that's all liberal. So anyway, it was just kind of funny. But she was like, and I'm like, yeah, that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's no judgment here, and that's the key thing, is to do all of this without judgment, and not say right or wrong. But it's like stepping outside of yourself and saying, okay, I'm going to put my personal views aside. I'm going to focus on this topic to drive business growth and understand different groups of people. And along the way, what you learn about the other side, which whatever that side is, becomes super interesting, and you come away knowing far more about that group than you ever imagined, and they become honestly more rational, more real. It doesn't make you any less liberal or conservative, but the understanding becomes really interesting. So anyway, to your question, the values. So I'll rattle off. There are 27. Okay, we're not going to go through all of them, obviously. 20 distinguish the two groups, and seven, these are more American values, unite Americans in terms of values. So the values I'm about to rattle off, um, each of the two groups has distinct, thinks about it differently. Okay, that's how to think about it. So they include things like the future, change boundaries, exploration, self-moderation, self-image, thought styles, influences, visual styles, empathy, trust, good and evil, fear and safety, horror. Now, if we just take one of the most interesting ones, and this relates, I think, in an interesting way to B2B and especially SaaS, which is the future, and it's the first one tackled. A liberal audience, for a liberal audience, the present is not acceptable. It needs fixing. So there is a desire to re-engineer and experiment to create a better future. For conservatives, the present is more acceptable, so there is less reason to change it. There is a desire to maintain it, and as a result, the future is more known. Okay. Now, it sounds kind of abstract and theoretical, but this has huge implications on launching an innovative product. And if it's disruptive and innovative, then for God's sake, focus on the liberal customers first. They are the early adopters. There's no question about that. But then you also want to have an eye toward the future. If your product gets traction, you want to then be able to shift toward conservative customers, because one of the most interesting insights that came out was that conservative customers, because they aren't experimenting with new products all the time, are more loyal and have higher customer value. But the cost per acquisition will be higher because they're harder to get, because they don't switch brands. Liberal customers will switch brands much more frequently in this desire to try new things and experiment. So there's an interesting market dynamic around that one. So that was one example. I can go into others if you want me to.
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering about the values where the two sides converge. Could you give any examples of that?
Yeah, so these are very US centric, and they relate, in the end, and this wasn't the intent of starting the research. In the end, they relate to, what people think of as the American dream and what's available in the United States and the original migration into the United States. And you can argue whether the American dream is still alive or not. Actually, the research shows that actually it is. But some people I know feel differently. But there are seven of them, and I'll just rattle them off. And so, and they'll sound, you know, to an American, it'll sound very familiar. And if you observe a lot of Americans, they will sound familiar. Independence and self determination, competition, productivity, ingenuity, directness, underdog, and friendliness and informality. Okay. And this came from reading 40 or 50 articles published by global organizations for people, students, or business people who are about to move to the United States and to prepare them for what they're going to experience in the US. And the overlap of all these articles was phenomenal. And there were even some funny anecdotes. I mean, it was like, the friendliness and informality. I mean, it's just Americans just, they smile all the time. They wave at people on the streets, total strangers, and you just don't do that anywhere else. And if you did, there was this one woman who wrote a piece from Spain who said, you know, when I see someone walking down the street smiling, I think they're insane, drunk, or American. You know, I, and then, it's like I was at my wife and I were at this little resort, and we're in Italy now, and we were at this resort over the weekend in this big pool with a lot of people, and there was one guy sitting on the edge of the pool with a laptop computer on his knees. And I said to my wife, I said, it's got to be an American. Just got to be productive at the pool. He just cannot stop, right? And so anyway, but if you think about those values, productivity, ingenuity, directness, rooting for the underdog, you could take those values and embed them in your brand and be very safe in terms of appealing to both groups. And that's why they're so interesting. But you may not want to appeal to both groups. If your market is really skews one way or the other, then you really want to think twice about that because you might just be watering things down.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how fascinating that is, Chris. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it kind of elucidates a point that you were saying before about a lack of judgment. Like those kinds of values really do humanize the person on the other end of the
Yes.
marketing and show that they're just people, they're just Americans, but they're all the same at heart. They all want to be friendly and nice and productive and work hard. So yeah, that is really, really great. You have mentioned some B2B specific points, and I would have liked to thread that through the conversation more, but I just was going with the flow because it was so fascinating. I did want to ask as the final question if you had any more specific B2B perspectives that might help
Yes.
our specific listeners.
So a lot of this, is developed through a lens of more B2C, but there is a really interesting set of research in the book around B2B, and that is we actually conducted research in conjunction with OpenSecrets.org, which is a nonprofit that helps understand where political money goes. Okay, like who's donating, and so we looked at billions of dollars in political donations. And the thing about the donations in the United States is that you have to you put down your job function when you do it, and it's open ended, so it was a bit of a pain kind of aligning everyone. But we actually looked at all the different areas in a business that and what their worldview skews would be. So if you're selling into HR or finance or IT or to executives, like what is their skew as a market, right? And I'll give you some examples. The best one, of course, is what we found out about between marketing and sales. So 67% of marketers from this research are liberal. 68% of salespeople are conservative. So you've wondered why, well, why don't marketing and sales always get along? It's been written about for decades and decades. Well, there you go. They just, there's a little bit of a different worldview, right? And it's not that, in my mind, it's not one's right or wrong. It's just different. And there are reasons why someone might be attracted to a marketing function who's more liberal and sales function that's more conservative. I won't get into that in detail, but one thing that came out of the research is that people of a certain worldview tend to be drawn to certain job functions because of the inherent role that that job involves. So, marketing involves having broad empathy with a lot of people you don't know. Well, that comes out of research that shows that, empathy among liberal people is much more wide ranging and less so with conservatives. And with conservatives, they're more into structure and hierarchy. And well, yeah, you kind of need that for a sales pipeline and to close sales. And it doesn't mean that you should only have liberal people doing marketing and conservative people doing sales. There's always complementarity, which is another huge theme that comes out. But just a couple of others, I'll just rattle off a couple really quickly. Um, Operations is actually split 50-50, liberal and conservative. But when you get into the functional areas, there are big skews. HR skews liberal, IT skews liberal, um, uh, admin skews conservative. I'm sorry, liberal. Finance skews conservative. Office and retail store management skews quite conservative. Product development. This is a really interesting one that relates to B2B, and this is where some self-awareness could really help. Product development skews very liberal, especially in software development. It's like 90, what is it, 89% liberal, 10% conservative. So now imagine software developers developing a SaaS product or another type of technology and injecting the product with their values. Not, it's not a conspiracy, it's just human nature. You cannot help but project your own values onto your work. I mean, but a small dose of self-awareness goes a long way. So maybe in the product design and maybe in how some of the features are structured, those could actually be adjusted based on this if your audience is more conservative. So yes, so knowing your audience in B2B can include worldview, depending on who you're selling into, whether it's a small business, big business, or what job function they possibly have, which is all in the book, and that was really fascinating as well.
Yeah, really fascinating. And I wonder if it also depends on the sector and you're right, the company size and whether people are in startups, they might be a bit more liberal skewing because they're maybe more risky or want change, and or if they're in enterprises, they might be more conservative. There's all these kinds of nuances and ways that you could segment your audience even more and really figure out those buying personas. So thank you so much, Chris. We have to wrap up now, but it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure our listeners will really enjoy it. I will maybe link your LinkedIn in the episode description if they want to connect with you.
Absolutely. Feel free to, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to chat about this. I find it fascinating. And you can also contact me through Lifemind AI, which is, we're building a SaaS platform using AI to help people understand the values, worldview, as well as generational and regional. So use the contact form there. I'd be happy to chat with people.
Absolutely. I'll link Lifefind and your book below.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.